Hi, it's me again, Kim Cobb, and this time I'm here to talk to you about COVID-19 and its impact on global emissions. Before I do that, I think it's important to note that this is a conversation that has been going on for the last couple months, ever since the pandemic started, with people noting some of the important similarities between the pandemic and the longstanding issue of climate change. And just to highlight a couple of those, because I think it's important to understand some of these similarities before we do a very deep dive on the emissions problem. First, of course, science and scientists have never been more important to preventing really alarming outcomes and protecting public health. And so I think that's the number one similarity between the pandemic and the climate change crisis. Number two, climate change threatens frontline communities, in particular low-income communities, in particular communities of color and other marginalized groups. And that is something we've known for quite some time. And data is beginning to bear that out for the pandemic as well, with higher infection rates, perhaps due to greater exposure, and higher rates of mortality for African Americans, for example, than other racial and ethnic groups. And so that's, I think, another important similarity between climate change and the pandemic. Another important similarity that I think that I'd like to note is that in both cases, we're going to need very effective, comprehensive policies that come from the highest levels of government that are using science to enact those policies to keep us safe, but that's not enough. They're going to have to be really followed by individuals who understand that their personal actions can either prevent the spread of the disease or prevent the ongoing acceleration of emissions, or of course, contribute to the problem willfully in many cases by the denial of science, the embrace of misinformation, and the renunciation of their personal responsibility. So this is going to take an all of the above kind of approach, and that's why I'm excited to share with you some of the very, very fresh data coming out on how the pandemic has affected global emissions. So let's look at some of that content, and this will be short because we still don't know a lot, and dig in from there. We'll know a lot more when you guys are done. So this is a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago by one of the world's greatest experts in global emissions inventory, Corinne Lecure, over in France. And they did an inventory just of April emissions and looked at what they could tell for system-wide reductions globally from a variety of different kind of bottom-up strategies. So they aren't looking at the concentrations in the sky. They're actually using things like traffic counts, plane tickets sold and flown, etc., to do a bottom-up inventory. And so I can't stress enough the importance of this paper for your guys' work. Please look it up, grab it, read it, know it. And if you're interested in getting an amazing deep dive by some experts in the world, you can look at this webinar that's linked down below here for the COVID climate webinar that actually includes Corinne Lecure as much as many other experts as well. So check that out. It's amazing. It's an amazing conversation, very educational. This is a key figure from that new paper showing some of the reductions that have already been quantified. And you'll see there's still some large uncertainties associated with some of these. So the y-axis is change in activity, where all those negative numbers are percent reductions for that specific sector that they looked at. And so, for example, you can see some of the grid impacts of the pandemic hitting the power sector in the purple lines over there, looking at the United States. Some modest drops as frankly residential grid needs increased, and for example commercial sector decreased slightly, but much bigger drops noted in India, in general, much larger drops noted in Europe. Moving over to some of these other numbers, the green are surface transport changes that are, of course, some of the most largest and most significant drops from zero, looking at, in some cases, almost 100% reduction in citywide congestion, which is, of course, they can use as an indicator of surface transport emissions. And the United States registering a whopping 50% or so reduction in surface transport, that surface cars and whatnot going around. And then the largest drops, not surprisingly, are associated with aviation, which really has taken the biggest hit, I think, of any sector in the pandemic here. Flights are down in the 90-something percent here in the United States and across the world, as you can see. So 50% to 100% reductions in aviation. So these are some of the kinds of data that help us understand how our economy has changed, how our emissions landscape has changed with this pandemic. This is in probably the phase of peak lockdowns as they occurred when the United States went into full lockdown, of course, and for most of April, and Europe was still in full lockdown. We expect some of these numbers will change and some of them won't going forward. Looking at the daily numbers of emissions, you can see the rise of daily emissions from 1970 to today, perhaps a smaller growth rate in recent years than in decades past, but then you can see that very large reduction going into and through the lockdown, and you can see the evolution of that kind of blown up on the right panel, where you're seeing the dip to about 90% and then another secondary dip to about 80%. On all, this was a 17% reduction in global CO2 emissions in April 2020 versus previous months and years. So that's very interesting. And one of my favorite tweeters, Zeke Hausfelder, looked at the recent EIA projections for coming emissions and note that this is something that they think will be falling over the next several years as our economy continues to adjust to the trends that are already underway in the coal-fired power plant reductions, noting the steep declines are a reduction in coal-fired power plants in this country, and noting that this will be another steep dive into the end of 2020. And 2021 is looking very low as well. So as we think about the economy rebounding, we think about how emissions will rebound. This will be a very interesting time for looking at where we land over the next several years, as we note probably battle through somewhat of a recession. Much, much, much closer to home, this is data that was compiled by Lalith Polapeti, one of the co-directors of the Carbon Reduction Challenge here. And he looked at Georgia Tech air travel emissions in April 2020 versus April 2019, and noted that there was a 97% reduction in the number of flights taken billed to campus sources from 1 year out. So that is quite dramatic. You can see in this plot here and how that coincides with the lockdowns and travel restrictions that rolled forward. And the interesting thing, of course, is that this is worth many, many tons of carbon dioxide avoided from these avoided flights. And perhaps very importantly to the point, there was about $800,000 to $900,000 avoided for those flight costs. That doesn't even count the costs of hotels that may have been purchased with those trips, any per diem or ground transportation that would have gone along on the ledger with those trips as well. And so very significant savings just from this 1 month of avoided flights. And this is a significant amount of money, given that Georgia Tech's budget gaps for the near future are something like $14 million. So this is a lot. Now, the question that falls in front of you this summer is really to consider what COVID-19 related changes may have occurred in the organization that you are partnering with, and which ones of those or what lessons might be taken to strategically choose to continue some of those going forward, even in a post-pandemic world or where the pandemic restrictions ease significantly, what are those aspects that could be carried forward to continue those kinds of carbon savings? We are living in a carbon constrained world. There are increasingly markets for monetizing emissions choices that would lead to large scale reductions. And of course, science tells us that we have only 10 or 20 years to work hard to limit the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And so that is in front of you. And I wanted to show the example of the Georgia Tech flights. Lala found in his analysis of those flights that up to 30% of those flights occurred within a single 24-hour window. So given that we have moved entirely and exclusively to remote work, many of us at any rate have, it really begs the question of whether a portion of these flights couldn't have been replaced by several Zoom meetings or the like to have avoided those very, very short flights. So that's the kind of thing that we hope you will be digging into, to think about what are the logistical constraints to making some of these changes long-term, what are the cultural constraints to making some of these changes long-term, and make sure that it's not exclusively viewed as a sacrifice. There are many benefits to some of the changes that have occurred, even though none of us chose them ourselves. Some employees and some organizations may be quite surprised at some of the positive benefits of these recent changes. So we can't wait to see what you will do, and we'll be with you every step of the way. And let us know if you have any questions.